All right, so just like we did, but to a lesser extent with how we did the tropical, temperate, polar. Please don't make me go through the hand motions again. But not so much polar, but you can also do that designation with your aquatic life zones. The reason why it's not as much of a distinction, of course, is because of the fact that ocean currents and everything reduce the amount of difference in temperature between the latitudes. You know, as your ocean currents go up from the equator, carry the heat energy up towards the northern and southern latitudes, that's going to make it, of course, so there's less temperature difference between them. So, but you do have some differences. You have your tropical neritic life zones, and the primary ones in there are your coral reefs and grass beds, seagrass beds. Okay, and we're talking a bit about those, so I'm not going to go into details about well, not the seagrass bed so much, but just in general. If you've ever seen like turtle grass and stuff like that, it is a submersed. It's actually a flowering, which is very rare in aquatic plants. Most of them are not that developed, but it is a flowering species, and the pollen and everything is transferred through the water. And it is common in shallow and warmer areas, and it's pretty productive. Turtles like it. Turtles like to eat that. Manatees as well are a big fan of the grass beds, and they're very good also for water clarity, for holding and keeping nutrients and everything in place. Then, of course, coral reefs. We've gone on quite a bit about those. They are, once again, your most biodiverse and productive per cubic meter ecosystem on Earth. The human impact for these are just basically, a lot of it has to do with access. You know, these are areas where people have to go through to get to land. So historically, you've had a lot of dredging operations and things like that in order to put ports in as ships got bigger and bigger. You also, of course, the fishing pressure has been the most in those areas historically. You know, we've just really started in the past century going out into the open ocean to do a lot of the fishing. So these areas have been overfished quite a bit. And as you know, and we talked about this when we talked about water pollution, the main source of water pollution in the ocean is runoff from the coastal areas, and therefore these particular areas, being your coastal life zones, they're going to receive the most of that. And sediment as well. You know, sediment technically is a type of pollution, but this is that sediment, of course. Now, the sediment is good. The organisms do need that for nutrients, but it's also bad if you get too much of it. It doesn't have time to settle because it does, the water clarity, of course, goes, and that, of course, is going to cut back the sunlight, and it can clog the gills of fish and benthic organisms and other kinds of things. So that's not a good thing. And a decrease in salinity due to water diversion. Now, to understand this, you have to remember why oceans are salty in the first place. The fact that the water, as it goes and precipitates from the water cycle and runs off across the land as it goes along, it picks up dissolved ions. So when you start off with water at what they call the headwaters, usually up in mountains and things, it's at its freshest or purest state with the least amount of dissolved substances, and it picks up more and more as it goes downstream, eventually to the ocean. And you have this area in there. Where is it? Did we get to talk about it yet? Okay, we'll get to it. But it's an estuary. Hopefully I didn't give you an answer. But an estuary is the area where that water, the fresh water, meets the ocean. By then it's semi-salty, but then in the estuary, it will also, the tides will bring salt water from the ocean into the estuary, and under other conditions, water from the runoff will push it out. So you have varying levels of salinity, but salinity is a big deal as an abiotic factor with a lot of marine organisms. So when we do water diversion, when we do things like dig canals and things to drain the land, or to use for agriculture and other kinds of things like that, we tend to increase the amount of water runoff that comes through and doesn't have a time to filter through the land, and therefore is not as salty. And so that is a negative effect on many organisms having lower salinity levels. In particular, corals are very sensitive animals to organisms to both temperature and salinity. And when they have variations in those factors, one of the things that they do is they will kick out the algae that's living inside them. For some reason, scientists are not really sure exactly what function that serves to do that, because they need that algae. But when they do that, and there'll be a time period, I'm not sure how long, but there'll be a little while the coral is still alive, that it's colorless. So they call it bleaching, because the algae is what gives coral its color, the little algae cells inside the coral. But then, of course, without that algae food source, and coral does eat other stuff, they're filter feeders, so they can survive for a little while, but typically after, I don't know, like I said, I don't know the time period, but they will die eventually if they don't reabsorb some algae to do that. So that's coral bleaching. Any questions about the tropical type life zones, aquatic life zones? All right, then you have the more temperate type, colder water. Kelp forests are the main thing you'll find in these. Benthic? Well, Benthic's not a life zone, so... Trying to think, no, because they're not strictly benthic. They extend all the way up to the surface of the water, so that wouldn't be accurate either. Temperate. That's what we're looking for here. So in the colder water areas, higher and lower latitudes, you find these. These are the kelp, of course. It's a big, long, they look like big wide blades of grass. They're actually a type of algae, multicellular algae. And they do root to the bottom. They don't have true roots though, because they're not a higher level plant, but they have what they call holdfasts that hold on to the bottom. And they're very productive. One of the reasons why they're very productive is because the cold water means that they hold more what's when it comes to things that stuff need in the ocean. What factor? Oxygen is correct. Very good. So therefore, that helps to make them very productive. And because of their high levels of productivity, a lot of fishing has been done, and overfishing in many cases in these particular areas. And since you have highly productive and nah. This is where you find most of your marine mammals, your whales. Dolphins are somewhat tropical, but most of your whales spend much of their time in this is where they do their feeding. They'll go to tropical areas to reproduce, raise their young, and then they'll migrate back up into the more temperate areas because of the higher oxygen levels, more plankton surviving there. And so they're common there, and of course we have done a lot of damage to those species through whaling and things like this. This also includes seals and stuff like that. Otters, you may know the story of that, how they were hunted near extinction for their pelts, and then because of that the urchins grew out of control, and the urchins ate the kelp, et cetera, so they were deemed as a keystone species. But that's just another example of how overfishing, overharvesting, obviously an otter's not a fish, but or whales, but overharvesting from these areas have caused the environmental impact that we've had there. All right, then you have your open ocean. There's a lot of different divisions in here. I'm not going to go into all that, so you don't have to worry about learning that. But you have basically a photic zone, which means a zone where you have what?
Sunlight.
Yeah, light. So sunlight penetrates to certain depths. In general, you can go down about 200 meters, and you hit what they call a twilight zone, where there's maybe like 10% of the sunlight is left penetrating down. Then you go down 15 to 1,500 meters, or 4,500 feet deep, and past that, it's complete darkness. So that obviously means that they're not going to be able to rely upon, in those lower depths, they're not going to be able to rely upon photosynthesis or photosynthetic organisms like plankton. By the way, make sure you put in here in your notes phytoplankton. Okay. So they have to rely upon marine snow, is correct. Although I hate that term. When I was growing up, we learned the real name for this. I'm going to give you the points because that's accurate. That's what they use nowadays. Detritus.
Somebody agreed.
I'm gonna write
Yeah, it does.
Probably rum.
fish poop, and other organic waste. Yeah. Everything that's growing up in the upper levels has to sink down. And although it's very low in density, primary productivity is usually measured on a per square meter or cubic meter basis. So for the open ocean, it's actually very low in density of producers in photosynthesis. But of course, it's the ocean, so there's a huge amount of it, and therefore the greatest number, the highest biomass of producers is phytoplankton in the open ocean, and also most of the world's oxygen is produced by this phytoplankton as well, and tremendous amounts of carbon dioxide are also absorbed by it. So, any questions?
No.